In 1970, you could buy a house in California for $23,100 on a median income of $9,302 a year. You could fill up your car with gas for less than $4. You could cruise Van Nuys Boulevard on a Wednesday night with thousands of other kids, and the police would just watch and let you do it. By 1980, that same house cost $84,500. Gas was being rationed. Van Nuys Boulevard had been shut down to cruisers. And California, the American dream made geography, had fundamentally changed. This is what happened in between. Let's start with the light, because that's where the illusion begins. If you look at photographs or watch films from 1970s California, there's this quality to the light that's almost impossible to describe. It's warm. It's saturated. It has this amber, honey-colored glow that makes everything look like it's happening during golden hour, that perfect moment right before sunset, when photographers will tell you the light is at its most beautiful. Except in 1970s California, it wasn't just golden hour. It was constant. Morning, noon, afternoon. That warm, hazy glow was everywhere. And there's a reason for that. It was smog. Now, when most people hear smog, they picture the gray, sooty pollution from industrial cities like London or Pittsburgh, the kind from coal fires and factory smokestacks. But Los Angeles had created something entirely different. Scientists called it photochemical smog, and it formed when sunlight hit the nitrogen oxides and hydrocarbons pouring out of millions of car exhaust pipes that didn't have catalytic converters yet. Here's what made it unique. The suspended particles in this smog were large enough to scatter light, but the nitrogen dioxide in the mix would specifically absorb blue light from the spectrum, while letting the longer wavelengths, the reds, oranges, and yellows, pass right through. So the physics of pollution literally filtered the California sky, creating those apocalyptic sunsets that would stretch across the horizon for hours. Bruised purple, blazing orange, colors so intense they looked fake. Cinematographers loved it. The film stocks they used back then, Kodak 5254, and later the more sensitive 5247, were perfect for capturing this light. The result was a visual texture that felt creamy, with pastel tones and a softness that modern digital cameras can't quite replicate. When you watch a movie like The Long Goodbye from 1973, the cinematographer actually used a technique called flashing, exposing the film negative to a small amount of uniform light before shooting, to enhance that milky, dreamlike haze even further. But for people actually living in Los Angeles, the romance of that golden light disappeared the moment you stepped outside during a thermal inversion. People who were there called them gas attacks. And that term dates back to the 1940s, but it was still brutally accurate in the 70s. The smog had this sharp, chemical smell like bleach or chlorine. It would hit you in the back of the throat, make your eyes water, sting your nose. If you went for a jog, or even just walked quickly, your chest would start to burn. Schools had smog alert days, just like snow days in other parts of the country. Except, instead of kids staying home to play in the snow, they were kept indoors because the air outside was literally dangerous to breathe. Physical education classes would be canceled. Recess would happen in the gym. The San Gabriel Mountains, this massive range that rings the eastern side of Los Angeles, would completely disappear. You couldn't see them at all, even though they were less than 15 miles away. People would drive down the Pasadena freeway and have to pull over to the shoulder because their eyes were tearing up so badly they couldn't see the road anymore. And yet, and this is the paradox at the heart of 1970s California, the population kept growing. Between 1970 and 1980, nearly 3.7 million more people moved to the state. They kept coming despite the smog, despite the oil crises, despite the drought, despite everything. Because the dream of California was so powerful that even when you were choking on it, you wanted to believe. Now, if the smog created the visual aesthetic of the decade, the car culture created the lifestyle. And nowhere was that more visible than on Van Nuys Boulevard. Picture Wednesday night, 1975. The sun's going down, painting the sky those impossible colors we just talked about. You're 17 years old, and you've borrowed your dad's car. Maybe a Camaro, maybe a Mustang, maybe just a beat-up Chevy that runs. You head to the San Fernando Valley, to this wide thoroughfare called Van Nuys Boulevard. And what you find there is something that doesn't exist anywhere in America anymore. Thousands of cars, thousands of teenagers, all of them cruising, driving slowly up and down the same stretch of road, windows down, stereos blasting, just to see and be seen. Wednesday was historically the big night, though weekends were busy too. The ritual had a geography. The epicenter was the parking lot, shared by Hughes Market and Nahas department store, with a Baskin-Robbins and June Ellen's Donuts flanking it. This lot was the turnaround point and the stage where people would park their cars, pop the hoods to show off chrome-plated engines, and just hang out in a scene that felt like a living movie set. The air smelled like gasoline and hamburgers and Aquanet hairspray. Somebody's 8-track tape was always playing. Wars, Lowrider, The Eagles, Fleetwood Mac. You could hear the rumble of 1,000 engines, feel it in your chest like a second heartbeat. The police were there, but their presence was ambivalent. Sometimes they'd show up to clear the lots, write tickets for open containers, move people along. But just as often, participants recalled that the cops would pull up, park, and just watch, acknowledging the cruise as an inevitable expression of youth culture that was going to happen, whether they liked it or not. For serious racers, the Boulevard was just the parade ground. The actual street races happened after midnight in industrial areas, or secluded stretches like Forest Lane, away from the police. But for most kids, the cruise itself was the point. It was a place to show off your car, meet people, feel like you belonged to something, and the cars themselves were changing. The high-compression muscle cars of the late 60s, the GTOs, the Chevelles, the Chargers, were becoming expensive to insure and feed. In their place rose something uniquely 70s, the custom van. The custom van craze was a cultural phenomenon that combined the decade's obsession with domestic comfort and the desire for nomadic freedom. The Ford Econoline, the Dodge Tradesman, the Chevy van, these became blank canvases for what people called pop art on wheels. The exteriors were covered in elaborate airbrushed murals depicting fantasy scenes. Wizards, dragons, unicorns, desert landscapes that looked like album covers. Artists like Skip Gage became celebrities within the scene, charging hundreds of dollars for custom paint jobs. But it was the interior that earned these vehicles the nickname Sin Bins. A typical high-end custom van in 1975 would have deep shag carpeting, covering not just the floor, but the walls and ceiling. There would be swiveling captain's chairs up front so you could turn around and face the rear when parked. Elaborate stereo systems with 8-track players, CB radios for convoy communication, and almost always in the back, a bed, sometimes even a waterbed, positioned behind velvet curtains with mood lighting. The van was about hanging out, not speed. It was perfect for camping trips to the desert, concerts, or just parking at the beach. It reflected the shift from the adrenaline-fueled 60s to the more laid-back, stoned vibe of the 70s. But this entire world, the cruising, the vans, the casual relationship with the automobile, was living on borrowed time. On May 9, 1979, California implemented odd-even gas rationing across 12 counties, affecting 10 million of the state's 15 million drivers. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could only buy gas on odd-numbered days of the month. Even numbers, even days. Before the 1973 OPEC embargo, gas cost roughly 40 cents a gallon. By 1979, it had passed $1, a price shock that fundamentally altered American behavior. The 1979 crisis, triggered by the Iranian Revolution, hit California particularly hard. Gas stations became zones of conflict. Lines stretched for blocks. Wait times were measured in hours. You'd drive around looking for a station that had fuel, and they'd have colored flags flying to indicate their status. Green meant gas available, yellow meant limited supply, red meant they were out. People started siphoning gas from other people's cars, which led to a boom in sales of locking gas caps. Station attendants, often just teenagers, found themselves facing irate customers who'd been waiting for 2 hours. In some places, the tension exploded into actual riots, people blocking intersections, setting fires, clashing with police. Americans were wasting an estimated 150,000 barrels of oil daily, just idling in those gas lines, which was its own kind of insanity. For the cruise culture, it was the death blow. When gas was 40 cents a gallon, you could spend $5 or $10 cruising all night. when it hit $1 and you had to wait in line for hours just to fill up. The casual Wednesday night cruise stopped making sense. As one participant put it later, the oil crisis put a bit of a damper on cruising. That's putting it mildly. Within a year, Van Nuys Boulevard on Wednesday nights had gone from thousands of cars to a trickle. The city eventually passed ordinances banning cruising altogether, but by then, the culture had already died of natural causes. The custom van craze died too. Those gas-guzzling behemoths that got maybe 8 miles to the gallon suddenly became impractical. Sales of Japanese imports exploded. By 1980, foreign cars captured 29% of U.S. sales, up from just 8% in 1966. Toyota surpassed Volkswagen. The Honda Civic became the symbol of the new reality, smaller, more efficient, less romantic. The muscle car era was over. The catalytic converter became mandatory in 1975, which improved the air but ended the high compression engines that had defined performance. The 55-mile-per-hour speed limit, enacted during the 1973 crisis, stayed in effect for decades. The dream of infinite mobility, the idea that you could just get in your car and drive wherever, whenever, for however long you wanted, had hit a wall called geopolitics. And California, which had built its entire identity around the automobile, had to reckon with what it meant when the cars stopped moving. But while the streets were emptying, something else was happening, something in the margins, in the overlooked spaces, that would end up changing everything. Southern California in the mid-70s was experiencing the worst drought in the state's recorded history. Reservoirs dropped to dangerous levels. Agriculture suffered massive losses. Cities implemented water restrictions so severe that in places like Bodega Bay, residents were limited to 50 gallons per person per day. The conservation slogan, "If it's yellow, let it mellow," entered California's vocabulary, and homeowners started draining their swimming pools. For a group of surfers from the decaying seaside neighborhood, locals called Dogtown, the Venice and Santa Monica area, those empty pools were a revelation. These kids were from working-class, broken homes. Venice in the 70s wasn't the trendy, expensive neighborhood it is today. It was rough, gang violence was common. The Pacific Ocean Park Pier, an abandoned amusement park, was a skeletal ruin where these kids would skate, dodging debris and danger. The core group called themselves the Z-Boys, short for Zephyr Competition Team, sponsored by Jeff Ho's surf shop. They'd developed a surfing style that was low and aggressive, with their hands dragging on the wave face, totally different from the upright, traditional approach that dominated the sport. When they found those empty pools with their rounded bottoms and vertical walls, they realized something. These pools were concrete waves. They started sneaking into people's backyards, urban guerrillas looking for empty pools, the way other kids looked for basketball courts. When they found one, they'd skate until the police showed up or the homeowner chased them off, then move to the next spot. The style they invented was revolutionary. They rode up the walls and ground the coping, the metal or concrete edge at the top of the pool wall. They launched into the air. This was vert skating, and it was completely different from the flat-ground freestyle skateboarding that dominated the sport at the time. In 1975, the Z-Boys showed up at the Del Mar Nationals, a skateboarding competition, and they shocked everyone. They didn't look like athletes. They looked like street kids, long hair, bandanas, a disdain for authority. Their skating was wild and fluid and aggressive. While other competitors were doing controlled, gymnastic-style tricks, the Z-Boys were attacking the course like it was a wave or a pool. They were skating low, powerfully, with a style that looked dangerous and felt dangerous. The team included future legends, Tony Alva, Jay Adams, Stacy Peralta. Also, Peggy Oki, who won women's freestyle and was one of the few female skaters in a male-dominated scene. This moment, the Z-Boys at Del Mar, is considered the birth of modern skateboarding. The aggressive punk aesthetic that defines skate culture today traces directly back to those Dogtown kids skating empty pools during a drought. And here's the thing, none of them were trying to start a revolution. They were just adapting their surf style to a new medium, because the drought had created these perfect concrete playgrounds. But in doing so, they created something that would spread around the world, a culture, an attitude, a way of moving through space that was uniquely Southern California in the 1970s. While they were redefining what you could do on 4 wheels in a backyard pool, another group was redefining what you could do with microchips in a garage. In March 1975, a group of hobbyists started meeting in a garage in Menlo Park. They called themselves the Homebrew Computer Club, and their gatherings would eventually move to the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center because they outgrew the garage. This wasn't a corporate research lab. This wasn't a university program. This was a bunch of guys, mostly guys, who were obsessed with the idea that computers, which at that point were massive machines owned by corporations and universities, could be small enough and cheap enough for regular people to own. The ethos of the club was radically open. Schematics were shared freely. The motto was, give to help others. If you figured something out, you showed everyone else how you did it. This was the opposite of corporate secrecy. This was the hacker ethic in its purest form. Among the people attending those meetings were Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. In 1976, Wozniak brought a prototype of what would become the Apple I to the club and passed it around. He wasn't trying to start a company. He was trying to impress his friends. He'd designed this computer to show off to the people whose opinions he valued, the other members of Homebrew who would appreciate the elegance of the engineering. Wozniak later said he optimized the design for the people who want to play rather than for corporate utility. He was building a tool for creativity and exploration, not for business efficiency. Jobs saw something else, a product, a company, an industry. But the culture that enabled that moment, the Homebrew Computer Club, the garage workshops, the open sharing of knowledge, was deeply influenced by the hippie counterculture that had exploded in California in the 60s. The engineers of the 50s had worn white shirts and ties, worked for big corporations, been organization men. But the tech workers of the 70s were different. They wore sandals and grew beards. They read the Whole Earth catalog. They'd experimented with LSD or spent time in communes. They saw technology not as a tool of corporate control, but as a means of personal liberation. Steve Jobs was a vegetarian who traveled to India seeking spiritual enlightenment. He'd taken acid. He practiced meditation. He embodied this fusion of Eastern mysticism and Western engineering that was uniquely Californian and uniquely 70s. The dress code in tech companies relaxed dramatically. Ties disappeared. T-shirts became acceptable. This was the casual Friday revolution decades before it hit the mainstream. And this specific cultural mix, the rigor of engineering, combined with the anti-authoritarianism of the counterculture, created the DNA of what would become Silicon Valley. It was a place where working alone in a garage could change the world, where dropping out of college wasn't failure, but liberation, where the goal wasn't to climb the corporate ladder, but to build something nobody had ever seen before. In 1976, the same year the Z Boys were revolutionizing skateboarding and Wozniak was showing off the Apple I, something else was happening in the hills above Hollywood, something that would soundtrack this entire decade and sell the California dream to the rest of the world. Laurel Canyon sits in the Hollywood Hills, high enough above Los Angeles that the smog was less oppressive and the air smelled like eucalyptus and sage instead of exhaust. In the early 70s, it was cheap to live there. Cheap rent in cabins and cottages tucked among the chaparral, just a 5-minute drive from the Sunset Strip. Musicians congregated there because it offered something rare, rural isolation with urban access. You could write songs surrounded by nature, then drive down to the Troubadour or the Whiskey A Go-Go to perform them at night. The community was famously incestuous. The Canyon Country Store was the village square, where you might find Chris Hillman buying coffee or Jim Morrison holding court. Houses were shared, swapped, visited. Joni Mitchell lived with Graham Nash. Graham Nash wrote Our House about her cottage on Lookout Mountain Avenue. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young rehearsed there for their album Deja Vu, which went diamond. The sound that came out of Laurel Canyon defined what people around the world thought California sounded like. 3- and 4-part harmonies, folk storytelling mixed with country instrumentation and rock amplification. It was sophisticated but accessible, polished but warm. The Eagles were perhaps the quintessential Laurel Canyon band, though they came together as Linda Ronstadt's backing musicians before striking out on their own. Their hits, Take It Easy, Peaceful Easy Feeling, Hotel California, narrated the California experience. the freedom of the road, the allure of the spotlight, the dark underbelly of hedonism. Hotel California, released in 1976, became the decade's anthem. The lyrics describe a beautiful place you can check into, but never leave. By the time it was released, the metaphor was already obvious to anyone actually living in California. The dream was becoming a trap. Fleetwood Mac moved to Los Angeles in 1975 and recorded Rumors while the band members' relationships were spectacularly imploding. Christine and John McVie were divorcing. Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks were breaking up. Mick Fleetwood's marriage was ending. The album's engineer later mentioned the community bag of cocaine that fueled the sessions. The result was one of the most successful albums in history, 31 weeks at #1, eventually selling over 40 million copies. But it was successful because it was honest about the pain beneath the California sunshine. The harmonies were beautiful, but the lyrics were about betrayal and heartbreak. Joni Mitchell's albums from this period, Court and Spark, The Hissing of Summer Lawns, were more sophisticated, more jazz-inflected. She was documenting the scene as it was happening, narrating the star-making machinery and the personal costs of the supposedly free lifestyle. But by the late 70s, a furious counter-reaction was brewing. The Mask opened in August 1977 in a grimy basement beneath a Hollywood Boulevard porn theater. It was 10,000 square feet of raw space that hosted X, the Germs, the Weirdos, and an early incarnation of the Go-Go's before fire marshals shut it down after 5 months. This was punk, deliberately ugly, deliberately confrontational, a rejection of everything Laurel Canyon represented. Where the Eagles sang about taking it easy, punk bands screamed about alienation and rage. Where Fleetwood Mac polished their sound to perfection, punk celebrated rawness and amateurism. Black Flag formed in Hermosa Beach in 1976. They pioneered hardcore punk and the DIY touring ethic, booking shows themselves, sleeping on floors, playing tiny clubs. They released records on their own label, SST Records, because no major label would touch them. The punk scene was small, maybe a few hundred people at its core, but it represented something important. California wasn't just sunshine and soft rock. There was anger here. There was poverty. There were people for whom the California dream had never been real in the first place. And punk's aesthetic, the raw honesty, the DIY ethic, the rejection of corporate polish, would eventually become mainstream, just like the Z-Boys skateboarding and the Homebrew computer club's hacker culture. California in the 70s was constantly generating these underground movements that would define the next decade. But there was a cost to all of this. There's always a cost. In 1970, the median home price in California was $23,100. The median household income was $9,302. That means a typical family could buy a house for about 2.5 times their annual income. By 1980, the median home price had reached $84,500, more than triple. But incomes hadn't tripled. They'd struggled to keep up with inflation, which peaked above 11% in 1980. Interest rates hit 20%. The math just didn't work anymore. The post-war promise that a working-class job could support a middle-class lifestyle, including homeownership, was breaking down. And people knew it. Property taxes were a big part of the problem. As home values skyrocketed, so did property tax bills, threatening to push longtime homeowners out of their houses even if they'd paid off their mortgages. This fueled a tax revolt that culminated in Proposition 13, which passed in June 1978 with 65% support. Prop 13 slashed property tax revenues by 53% and fundamentally restructured California's public finance system. It's still controversial today. Supporters say it protected homeowners from being taxed out of their houses. Critics say it gutted funding for schools and public services and created perverse incentives that favor long-term homeowners over newcomers. But what it really represented was this. The dream was getting expensive. The California that had drawn millions of people with the promise of cheap land, abundant work, and endless sunshine was closing its doors. Not officially, not legally, but economically. If you didn't get in before 1975, you were probably already priced out. The 1973-75 recession brought 9% unemployment, the highest since World War II, combined with double-digit inflation. This stagflation defied traditional economics. Usually unemployment and inflation move in opposite directions. But in the 70s, you had both at once. A gallon of milk cost $1.32. Bread was 24 cents a loaf. Eggs were 60 cents a dozen. Minimum wage was $2.10 an hour. These numbers sound impossibly cheap now, but at the time, people were struggling. The cost of living was rising faster than wages. And yet, if you watch TV shows or movies from the period, everyone seems to be having a pretty good time. The Brady Bunch kids lived in a huge house in the valley. Happy Days was about the 50s, but was made in the 70s and reflected 70s nostalgia for a simpler time. Even the grittier shows like Sanford and Son or The Rockford Files showed working-class characters getting by okay. The gap between the media representation and the lived reality was growing, and nowhere was that gap more obvious than when you looked at the things nobody wanted to talk about in public. Los Angeles homicide rates increased 84% between 1970 and 1979, the largest decade-long spike on record. The rate went from 12.5 to 23.0 per 100,000 residents. The LAPD established CRASH, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, in 1979 to combat emerging gang violence. The Crips and Bloods were consolidating power in South Los Angeles, and the drug trade was becoming more violent and more organized. But gang violence, as terrible as it was, at least made a kind of sense. It had causes you could point to: poverty, neglect, the collapse of manufacturing jobs, white flight, police brutality. It was a social problem with social roots. What didn't make sense were the serial killers. The Zodiac Killer was still active into the early 70s, sending taunting letters to newspapers until 1974. He claimed 37 victims, though only 5 were confirmed. He was never caught. The Golden State Killer, who wouldn't be identified until 2018 as former police officer Joseph James D'Angelo, committed at least 51 rapes and 13 murders between 1976 and 1986. He terrorized Sacramento and then Southern California, and he did it while working in law enforcement. The Hillside Stranglers, cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, murdered 10 women and girls between October 1977 and February 1978. They dumped the bodies on Los Angeles hillsides, which is how they got their name. The fear was so pervasive that women refused to go out after dark. The city felt genuinely dangerous in a way it hadn't before. And then there was Jonestown. Jim Jones had built his People's Temple in San Francisco, opening a church on Geary Boulevard in 1971. He cultivated political connections with Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. He was appointed chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority. He looked like a legitimate civic leader. In 1977, facing media scrutiny, he moved his followers to Guyana and established a settlement they called Jonestown. On November 18, 1978, 909 people died there, 276 of them children. It was the greatest single loss of American civilian life until September 11, 2001. Most of them were from California. Most of them were from the Bay Area. The word cult became part of everyday vocabulary in the 70s. Manson, Jonestown, Hare Krishnas chanting at airports, Synanon, the Children of God. California seemed to generate these groups, or attract them, in ways that other states didn't. Maybe it was because California had always been about reinvention, about becoming someone new, about leaving your old life behind and starting fresh. But that same openness to transformation that made the state attractive to entrepreneurs and artists also made it attractive to charismatic leaders who wanted to control people. The darkness wasn't new. The smog, the racial tensions, the violence, these had been building for decades. But in the 70s, they became impossible to ignore. The sunny narrative couldn't hold anymore. The interesting thing is that Hollywood was documenting this contradiction even as it was happening. Roman Polanski's Chinatown came out in 1974. It's set in the 1930s, but it's really about the 1970s. The film is shot in blinding, desaturated sunlight, not the shadowy darkness of classic film noir. Everything is visible, but that visibility doesn't reveal truth. It conceals it. The plot is about water theft, about the powerful men who built Los Angeles by stealing resources from farmers in the Owens Valley. And the message is clear. The California dream was built on corruption. The foundation was rotten from the start. The sunshine was always a lie. Shampoo, released in 1975, takes place on Election Day 1968, but captures the sexual politics of the 70s. Warren Beatty plays a hairdresser navigating Beverly Hills society, riding his motorcycle through traffic, attending endless parties, pursuing shallow connections. The film ends with him alone, having lost everything despite, or because of, his commitment to hedonism. The Long Goodbye, Robert Altman's 1973 update of Raymond Chandler, turned Philip Marlowe into a shambling, mumbling figure who doesn't fit in 1970s Los Angeles. The visual style, achieved by flashing the film to lower contrast, created a washed-out pastel look that made everything feel hazy and disconnected. The city Marlowe moves through is stoned, disoriented, morally unmoored. These films were trying to tell the truth about California in ways that the Eagles' harmonies and the Crew's culture couldn't. They were saying, look at where we actually are. Look at what we've actually built. But here's the complication. California in the 70s wasn't one thing. It was many things, depending on where you were and who you were. If you were in San Francisco, you were living in the most progressive city in America. Harvey Milk won election to the Board of Supervisors in 1977, the first openly gay elected official in California. The Castro went from a quiet Irish working-class neighborhood to a cultural and political powerhouse for the LGBTQ+ community. The city's gay male population grew from about 30,000 to 100,000 during the decade. Then, 19 days after Milk helped defeat Proposition 6, which would have banned gay and lesbian teachers from public schools, he and Mayor George Moscone were assassinated at City Hall by former Supervisor Dan White. If you were in Orange County, you were living in one of the most conservative regions in America. The county was pioneering the master plan communities and homeowners associations that would define suburban development for the next 40 years. Disneyland was still the main attraction. The conservative movement that would eventually elect Ronald Reagan president was being organized in Orange County living rooms. If you were in the Central Valley, you were watching farm workers organize under Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. The California Agricultural Labor Relations Act passed in 1975, the first law in the nation guaranteeing agricultural workers the right to organize. The Great Boycott had been the most successful consumer boycott in American history. If you were Vietnamese, you were probably one of the 125,000 refugees who came to California after the fall of Saigon in 1975. Camp Pendleton processed 50,000 people in 6 months. By the end of the century, over half of America's Vietnamese population would live in California, concentrated in Orange County, San Jose, and Los Angeles. So, when we talk about 1970s California, we're really talking about dozens of different Californias, each with its own narrative, its own dream, its own reality. But they all shared one thing. They were all changing faster than anyone expected. The decade ended with two symbolic moments. First, on November 27, 1978, Harvey Milk and George Moscone were murdered. When Dan White received only a voluntary manslaughter conviction and a 7-year sentence for killing them, the White Night riots erupted in San Francisco. The California that was supposed to be progressive and tolerant had revealed itself to be something more complicated. Second, on November 4, 1980, Ronald Reagan, former governor of California, was elected president. He won 44 states in a landslide. His victory signaled a national shift away from the introspection of the me decade toward a new era of optimism that was really about corporate ambition and military buildup disguised as mourning in America. California, which had invented so much of the counterculture, had now produced the leader who would define the conservative 80s. The physical landscape was changing too. The Googie architecture, those futuristic coffee shops with swept-wing roofs and starburst signs, was being demolished or remodeled. The conversation pits were being filled in. The shag carpeting was being ripped out. The muscle cars were being replaced by imports. The smog was improving. The Clean Air Act amendments of 1970, the mandatory catalytic converters starting in 1975, the increasing environmental regulations, all of this was working. The air was getting cleaner. The San Gabriel Mountains were becoming visible again. But as the air cleared, so did the golden light. The toxic beauty that had defined the decade's aesthetic was disappearing. The sunsets were less dramatic. The photographs looked different. The particular visual quality that had made 1970s California look like a dream was fading because it had been pollution all along. Van Nuys Boulevard was quiet on Wednesday nights. The custom vans were parked in driveways, too expensive to drive. The Zaboys had moved on to other things. Some became professional skaters, some struggled with addiction, some just grew up. The Homebrew Computer Club had disbanded. Its members were either working for Apple and Atari and Microsoft, or still tinkering in garages. Laurel Canyon was still there, but the musicians were different. Punk and new wave were taking over from soft rock. The recording studios were moving to other neighborhoods. The rent was going up. The California dream hadn't died exactly. It had just gotten expensive, exclusive, harder to reach. In 1970, you could arrive in California with a high school diploma and find work that paid enough to rent an apartment and buy a car and eventually save up for a house. By 1980, that math didn't work anymore. The door was closing. But here's what survived: the innovations. The Z-Boys skateboarding culture spread around the world and became a multi-billion-dollar industry. The Homebrew Computer Club's hacker ethic became Silicon Valley's operating system. The environmental movement that started in California with the first Earth Day led to nationwide regulations that cleaned the air and water. The LGBTQ+ rights movement that coalesced in the Castro became the template for activism that would eventually win marriage equality. Even the darkness, the serial killers, the cults, the violence, changed how Americans thought about safety and community and trust. True crime became a genre. We became more aware, more paranoid, more careful. The music that came out of Laurel Canyon is still playing. Hotel California is still on the radio. The films, Chinatown, The Long Goodbye, Shampoo, are still studied in film schools as examples of how to capture a specific time and place. So maybe the question isn't whether 1970s California was paradise or hell. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was a place where the sun shone golden and the roads ran free, and also a place where you couldn't breathe the air and the dream was already dying. Maybe the contradiction was the point. The people who lived through it carry that decade with them. They remember cruising Van Nuys Boulevard and the smell of smog. They remember watching the Zaboys skate and listening to the Eagles and feeling like California was the center of the universe. They remember when gas was cheap and houses were affordable, and you could reinvent yourself just by driving west. And they remember when it ended, when the gas lines formed and the prices tripled and the golden hour faded into ordinary light. The roads ran free in the 1970s, but they led somewhere none of them expected,